Okay, students, today we're going to talk about post-World War II Europe and the role that oil played in that. It actually spread out. If you look at this map, it talks about the Cold War in Europe. Some of the countries that Russia or the Soviet Union had invaded during World War II have now become communist countries by 1950. And what we see is that the two superpowers actually emerged from the war, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, what we did was we entered into what was known as the Cold War, and that means that it really didn't get to be a fighting war per se. And what occurred was the Soviet Union was looking to spread communism around the globe. And the United States was there as a buffer to try and keep that from happening. Now, it was not a hot war. It lasted from the 1940s to 1991, when the Soviet Union actually collapsed and communism died. And now they are allegedly a republic. At the beginning of the Cold War, the Western powers, actually NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, nations such as the United States and Great Britain believed what Hitler believed, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In 1946, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, gave a speech stating that an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and he wasn't wrong about that. The Soviet Union locked Eastern Europe up very easily and didn't let anything to go in or out, as a matter of fact. In 1947, we saw the Truman Doctrine, which means that the United States was going to use whatever means necessary to keep communism from spreading and keep it where it is, a policy of containment. Now, what happened after the war in Berlin was that the Soviets had cut off any food supplies from the outside. And when they did that, the United States formed what was called the Berlin Airlift, where they brought planes in with food and necessary supplies for the people that were there. Now, the Marshall Plan was formulated by George C. Marshall, who was a former Army general, chief of staff, and what they were going to do is they were going to sink a lot of money into rebuilding Europe after the Second World War. The big question after the war was, what role would Saudi Arabia play in world affairs, since there had been located a large deposits of oil in the Middle East.
The need to rebuild a devastated Europe and contain communism gave birth to a massive American aid program, the Marshall Plan. Here, too, Arabian oil played its part.
The oil companies can deliver increased oil production. And in fact, the oil companies become vehicles of the national interest in foreign oil. Now, this national interest is not oil from the Middle East for the United States. It's oil from the Middle East for Western Europe for economic recovery. It's oil from the Middle East for Japan for economic recovery. Now, economic recovery is, in turn, is seen as crucial to stability, to democracy, and to the containment of communism in Western Europe and in Asia.
A new relationship was surely emerging between the United States and Saudi Arabia. A full-scale official visit was arranged for the Crown Prince.
There was a clear policy within the government that development of Middle Eastern oil rapidly was a good idea because it would conserve resources in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, anything we could do to support the companies and Saudi Arabia for producing oil, for selling it worldwide, was a good idea.
Access to oil was critical to the West in the Cold War. Oil was vital to Saudi economic development, and the American relationship was vital to Saudi security.
There was one critical point that always came through, and that was the king's belief that Saudi Arabia was encircled. The British, that is in the Trucial States, were encirclers. The Hashemites in Iraq were encirclers. The Egyptians were encirclers. The Jordanians were encirclers. And there was encirclement. Therefore, he needed help, and the United States he was turning to.
Even though Saudi Arabia had come to the table with large deposits of oil, and that oil was needed, of course, there were specific things that occurred in the world at the time that we call proxy wars. Now, what do proxy wars mean? That means that the Soviet Union and the United States would fight wars against themselves, but their armies wouldn't fight against each other. They would support armies that would actually of other countries. Specifically, the Cold War basically starts to get a little hot during the Korean conflict in 1950, where North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. The North Koreans were communists, and this was known as a proxy war.
Following World War II, different political, economic, and military alliances emerged as the two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, vied for dominance. With the world in shambles, nations looked for partnerships with these two countries to rebuild and gain advantage over old enemies. Providing this help led to a new role for the United States, one it did not fully understand and for which it was not prepared. For the first time, Americans faced an enemy that wanted to destroy their way of life. The Soviet Union planned to encircle America with communist governments and then crush its economic and military might. As the nation looked out on the world in 1947, it saw the Western Hemisphere, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe as potential spheres of influence and conflict. Truman and Secretary of State George Marshall chose Europe as the region to make America stand against communism. Implementing the Marshall Plan and weathering the Berlin airlift, the United States would eventually win this battle. However, Asia was an enigma to the United States. It was so far removed from what seemed to be the nation's interest. Communism was no threat in conquered Japan. Surprisingly, communist parties sprang up in China, Indonesia, Vietnam, North Korea, and the Philippines. The stage was being set for what would be called America's Forgotten War, the first military conflict between the United States and communism. And it would take place in Korea. Korea occupies a small peninsula at the western edge of mainland China. In 1945, American and Soviet forces liberated the country. Both sides accepted the 38th parallel as the military dividing line. The U.S. believed that both armies would withdraw, allowing Korea to become a free and united nation. In the summer of 1948, South Korea formed a government under Syngman Rhee, with the idea that it would become the government of all Korea. However, 3 weeks later, North Korean leaders founded the People's Republic of Korea and also claimed jurisdiction over all of Korea. A year later, on June 29, 1949, leaving only 500 advisors behind, the last American troops left, tragically without implementing a plan for reunification. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean leaders attempted to unify the country in their own way. Soldiers equipped with Soviet-made weapons and tanks attacked an under-equipped South Korean army and drove it down the peninsula to the tip of Busan. President Truman responded quickly. He authorized the United States Navy and Air Force to aid the South Korean troops. With this order, a new kind of war began for America, the war against communism.
In an effort to contain communism, the United States went into the third world was basically decolonization. Now, what this was nations that had been taken over by superior powers during a particular period of time were known as third world countries. Well, they had communist revolutions in a lot of those countries. Africa, later on we would see Cuba become communist, and after the Vietnam War, Vietnam would become communist. But if you look at this map, it'll show you these colonies that were once belonged to the great powers of Europe are now declaring their independence. Now, it was in the United States' best interest to figure out what type of governments were going to come to power in these nations. And that was not easy. Through this containment policy, the United States was going through an unprecedented prosperity. All major competitors were destroyed or occupied. And when soldiers returned home, they had what was called the GI Bill, which paid for all their tuition. They went to college. And this is known as the baby boomer generation, from 1946 to 1964. I'm part of that generation. I was born in 1963. Well, how does this prosperity, translate into how oil had a big impact on the world after World War II?
America lifted petrol rationing within 24 hours of the end of World War II. As the nation celebrated, few worried where the oil would come from or who would control it. The country turned to the pleasures and the prosperity of peace.
Soon you'll be able to give that jalopy a well-earned rest. With gas again plentiful, and with new cars and new tires on the way, America will be rolling with a pre-war flourish. Yes, cars, radios, vacuum cleaners, nylons, juicy steaks. It sounds almost like a dream.
But it was during the decades following World War II that oil consumption reached its apex. As America entered the 1950s, the nation's reliance on oil had grown from a necessity to an addiction. It was an addiction driven by the automobile. America's love affair with the car was consummated. Between 1945 and 1950, the number of vehicles on America's roads climbed from 26 million to 40 million.
At the end of World War II, American life is transformed, and transformed largely by the automobile. The automobile makes it possible for you to live a long way from your job and to commute to work.
Americans are not only buying the house in the suburbs, they're buying a car. In some cases, if they're wealthy enough, they buy two. The other thing that happens is Americans want bigger and bigger cars. The 1950s and 60s are the heyday of what some people call the muscle cars, the V8s, the 400 plus horsepower. And these, of course, are not very fuel efficient. And so our consumption of gasoline and motor oil skyrockets in this period.
The Hydrocarbon Society brought with it drive-ins, fast food, and a new prosperity. Millions took to the road on the new highways.
A road sign points the way to one of America's great new superhighways. Now, a motorist traveling from New York to Delaware can drive non-stop the 118 miles of the New Jersey Turnpike in 2 hours.
The major companies fought to stimulate brand loyalty among motorists. Competition was cutthroat, but for all their rivalry, the different brands were virtually identical. And behind the competition, the companies worked together in joint ventures in many of the producing countries.
For American oil companies, competition was more intense than ever. Dozens of corporate giants battled for the consumer's dollar. In addition to the companies that emerged from Standard's breakup and those that blossomed out of the Spindletop strike, other corporations were making their presence felt in the marketplace. International concerns like British Petroleum were increasingly competitive in the U.S., and Phillips Petroleum had sprung up from the rich oil patch of Oklahoma to become a major player.
The sweetest rhythm on the road from Phillips 66. Drive with light fuel. You knew light fuel. For the sweetest rhythm on the road.
With 20 companies all selling essentially the same product at the same price, image and service became the hallmarks of the post-war oil industry.
You can trust your car to the man who wears a star. He's the man best qualified to take care of your car at every Texaco station. Clean enforcement nation. You can trust your car to the man who wears the star. So trust your car to the man who wears the star.
Every car of every make, any age and any shape, summertime and winter too. Here's the oil that's right for you.
Even Marilyn Monroe proclaimed the unique virtues of a brand of gasoline.
This is the first car I ever owned. I call her Cynthia. She's going to have the best care a car ever had. Put Royal Triton in Cynthia's little tummy.
Right, lady.
Cynthia will just love that Royal Triton.
With the mass production of automobiles and highways, roads being built, people who wouldn't normally have access to anything else, their jobs were far away. They could drive to their jobs now. They didn't have to take the bus. There was an Interstate Highway Act of 1956 which improved all the highways. Now, if you look at this map, this shows you how the highway system came about. Specifically, Interstate 10 was part of that particular building project. There were technological advances. People were able to afford houses. When you look at that type of prosperity, oil had had a lot to do with that. Not only did it have a lot to do with the United States, but other nations as well had to have oil. It became one of those commodities that were very important.
Oil had been a big business, a global business right from the beginning. But the Second World War demonstrated more than ever before that oil was also a key part of grand strategy, essential to the power and the position of nations. Oil was more political than ever before. This increased the anxiety about where oil supplies would come from, how would they get to market, would there be enough, would they be safe? And all of that stood in marked contrast to the situation in the 1930s, before the Second World War, when the issue was too much oil and what to do about it.
After the war, when oil became such a hot commodity, there was the Saudi Arabia took a role in oil production with Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, and there was an economic miracle in Germany and Japan at that time.
Until the end of the 1940s, the United States and Latin America provided the bulk of Europe's oil. And then the Middle East took over, fueling these economic miracles in Western Europe and then in Japan. Really, two key things were happening. The rest of the world was following the American example, shifting from coal to oil. And at the same time, economic growth meant rapidly rising consumption of oil in factories and power plants and automobiles. So the world was going to need a lot more Saudi oil, much more than the two Aramco partners, SoCal and Texaco, could provide. And the investment requirements they faced would be staggering.
So in the Great Oil Deal of 1947, Aramco was expanded to include two bigger and richer partners. Aramco's original partners, SoCal and Texaco, were joined by Esso and Saccone Vacuum, later to become Exxon and Mobil. SoCal is today's Chevron. 2 years earlier, one U.S. government official had said he did not care which American company or companies developed the Arabian reserves, just so long as they were American.
Japan's astonishing growth was based on a strategic decision to switch its economy from coal to oil. The Japanese miracle transformed the country into a major industrial power. Most of Japan most of Japan's oil, like that of the rest of the world, passed in one way or another through the hands of the majors. Governments saw that oil was vital to the national interest.